So Listverse released a list recently called 10 Reasons Antinatalists Think You Shouldn't Have Been Born. I thought it might be interesting to go through this list, so let's get stuck in. And by the way, before we begin, I'm not going to be reading the article out word for word, so if you want to read what's actually in the article word for word, then it's linked in the description. So the first one is, you did not consent to being born. So whilst to many people it seems ridiculous to say that not being able to get consent from someone to bring them into existence counts against bringing them into existence, it's a principle that many people strongly stand by in many other aspects of their life. Consent tends to be strongly adhered to by many people in a whole variety of aspects of our lives, not least imposing harm on others. And usually the violation of consent only really gets entertained when the violation of that person's consent is going to stave off a greater harm than the one that you will be imposing by violating their consent. So a classic example is if a bus is coming down the road and someone is in the middle of the road and they don't see the bus, of course they don't consent to you pushing them out the way, but the small harm of you pushing them is preventing them from befalling a greater harm by being hit by the bus. This obviously isn't the case when someone's being brought into existence, because if someone doesn't exist, there's no harm they can come to, so we can't be preventing a greater harm by imposing the harms of existence on them. Another thing people may say is that we're able to violate someone's consent when we want to bestow them a benefit. Now, even this is disputed by people, because obviously one person's benefit can be something someone else doesn't want. A benefit can also have unintended consequences. And that's even when it's a pure benefit. When you bring someone into existence, you're not bestowing a pure benefit on them. There are harms that come along with that, and the risks of great harm as well. And in many aspects of our life, people would say, even if you wanted to bestow a benefit on someone, if that comes associated with a guaranteed harm and a risk of really substantial harm, and obviously in the case of creating someone, it comes with the guarantee of death as well, then given that there would be no one in existence to be deprived of the benefit if we weren't to create them, we should just err on the side of not doing that, given that we can't get that person's consent to bestow that benefit upon them. Anyway, Listverse also linked an article by Sam Wolf called Antinatalism and the Consent Argument, which you can dive into if you want to get more information on this. Number 9 is, being alive entails suffering. So often when people use the word suffering, especially if they're people who, usually get into sort of online debates and stuff, the term suffering often really loses its actual substance. But suffering is a very real and tangible thing that people go through, and it can be horrifying. From being a burn victim to a cancer victim to becoming demented to more everyday things that people may see as mundane, like a bit of food poisoning or general illness, separation anxiety, death anxiety, existential anxiety, grief, general depression, and the list goes on and on and on and on. When you create someone, you create out of what was nothing an individual who now is contained within this sort of flesh suit that is able to experience intense suffering. And all of us are guaranteed to go through some level of suffering, and we all have the guarantee of death, and we all have that risk that there's going to be an extreme amount of suffering in our lives. And when one person creates another, they don't actually know. They can guess, but they don't actually know how that person's life is going to turn out and how much suffering it is going to contain. And number 8 is, bad things are worse than good things are good. Now, this can be mistaken as David Benatar's axiological asymmetry, but it actually isn't. It's one of the empirical asymmetries that he discusses in his book, Better Never to Have Been.
The worst pains are much worse than the best pleasures are good. We can test this. If somebody doesn't believe us, we can offer them a choice. Of course, it'd be unethical to really follow through with this choice, but we could say to them something like, well, we'll give you 5 minutes of the worst pains imaginable. And then we'll give you, let's say, 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of the best pleasures imaginable in exchange. Would you take that deal? And I think any rational person wouldn't take that deal, because to put up with the worst pains imaginable for 5 minutes is just excruciating. It is much, much worse than the best pleasures are good.
Just think of the worst things that have happened throughout history and line them up against the best things you can think of that have happened throughout history. It would be pretty hard to find things that have happened that are better than the Holocaust in World War II was bad, or the slave trade in general was bad, or the Rwandan genocide, or the Great Leap Forward in China, or World War II and World War I generally. All of these things put individuals through intense against suffering that I think most people watching will find hard to find anything good to stack up against and say, this is more good than those things were bad. Just a quick note on this one as well is that there are other empirical asymmetries as well.
And here I think there are a range of other asymmetries that are relevant between pleasure and pain, which suggest very, very strongly that there is more bad in life than good. And I'll mention just a few of them. So think about chronic pain. There are lots of people who suffer from chronic pain at some point in their lives. They start and it goes on and on for years, sometimes the remainder of their lives. There is no such thing as chronic pleasure.
Correct.
Think about an injury. An injury can happen in seconds. You might never recover from the injury, but if you do, recovery is very slow. The worst pains are much worse than the best pleasures are good.
Number 7 is parents gamble with your life. So this is really the risk argument for antinatalism. And essentially what it says is that in each generation, let's say, there are people who will have what we deem to be fairly average lives. There will be people who we deem to have fairly good lives. And there are also people who we deem to have absolutely awful lives that none of us would want to live. And that pretty widely we would accept that they would have been better not coming into existence. Even the most natalist people would probably agree with those people being pretty fucked over by the fact they came into existence. Now, when someone creates another person, as I said previously in the video, they don't know how that person's life is going to end up. They can try influence it in some ways, and they can give their best guess, but they don't know where their child's life is going to turn out. This is the gamble that parents take when they create someone. They create someone and put them into a situation where they actually don't know how that person's life is going to turn out, and that person could fall into the category of people who have those lives that even people outside of antinatalism agree were screwed over by creating them. An additional thing to say here is that from an antinatalist point of view, given that actually everyone is guaranteed to suffer to some degree and everyone dies, it's often said that creating someone or having a child is playing Russian roulette with the gun pointed at someone else's head and the gun fully loaded. If you want to read more about this, there is a paper called A Rational Cure for Pre-Reproductive Stress Syndrome by Matti Hyry, which I will link in the description. But also the article itself has linked a paper by Matti called Children into This World, Really. Those will both be linked in the description. Number 6 is we all die in the end. So as I've already referenced multiple times in this video, all of us die. No one is going to escape death. And death is widely seen by people as a harm. It's one of the harms of coming into existence which you aren't going to escape. And knowing this is the case, when someone creates another person, they put this person in a catch-22 where even if that person wants to avoid causing suffering to others, they're almost guaranteed to do so. Even just by the fact that at some point they will die. Once we're born, throughout our lives, we form attachments to things and people form attachments to us. We have relationships, we have friends, we have family, and we cherish some or all of them. When someone's brought into existence, they are put into this complex web of relationships, duties, responsibilities, with their creator having known that that person will eventually die. And so one day, we will cause suffering to others simply by just not existing anymore. But also, we've been put into a situation where it's known we are going to get attached to things, we are going to enjoy things, we're going to have this inherent desire to want to continue existing. But built into the situation we're in is that that desire will ultimately be violated. Now, one thing I quickly do want to note on is that in the article, it suggests that antinatalists have this view that death is like the time before you had come into existence, which actually isn't the case. There are some antinatalists, like there are some natalists as well, who believe death isn't a harm. But there are also many antinatalists who believe death is a harm, and that's actually one of the reasons they don't want to create people, because they know they're going to die. Number 5 is religion suggests that non-existence is better. So I'm not going to say too much on this one because I don't know enough about the intersection of antinatalism and religion, but there are many religions, including Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and I'm sure more, that have passages in their texts and the teachings that contain antinatalist sentiments, if not outrightly antinatalist statements. I will try to find some links below of things people can watch or read to look into this more, so I'll leave them in the description. But other than that, I don't want to go into this too much because I simply just don't know. One recommendation I will make here though is to read this book, Antinatalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar by Ken Coates. This is not entirely about religion, but it does contain some information about antinatalism in some of the ancient religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So for anyone interested in this topic, this might be an interesting read. There there are other books available as well, and I will try and find some and link them in the description. Number 4 is suicide is painful. So we've already talked about death, but what about dying? So one of the things that often gets said to antinatalists is, why don't you kill yourself if you think existence is so bad? Now, I'm not going to go into that. I've already done a video on it. I will link it in the description. I think it's fairly obvious why that question is completely misguided. And one of the reasons is that suicide is really awful for a person to go through, by and large. I know there are some specific areas in the world where you can access a sort of dignified way of dying, but this, by and large, in the vast majority of cases, is not the circumstance someone is in when they decide to take this course of action. So when we create someone, we know that there is a possibility that they may regret having come into existence, and they may actually get to the point where they want to remove themselves from existence. So now what we need to think about is the fact that we've just put someone in a situation where the only way they can escape it is by committing suicide. Often people say, oh yeah, well, why don't they just do that? Not really realizing the gravity of what they're talking about. For a human being, an animal that has this built-in evolutionary desire to want to continue existing would have to be in a supremely shit state of affairs to want to even take that action in the first place. Having to then go through that action is horrifying for that person, but also the people around them. And so the suggestion that people should commit suicide, given so lightly by many people engaging with antinatalists, honestly to me suggests that those people should themselves not be reproducing. But anyway, I think for the average person watching, the reasonable person watching, they understand why suicide is a harm to that person and it's an awful thing to go through. So I'll leave it at that. Number 3 is existing is worse than not existing. So in David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, he presents 2 characters to represent why coming into existence actually has no advantage over never existing, and why there is a disadvantage built into it. He presents these 2 characters, healthy and sick. So sick is prone to bouts of illness, but sick actually also has this inbuilt capacity to recover very quickly from illnesses. Now, obviously for sick, it is bad that they get ill, but it's good that they have this ability for quick recovery. Healthy, on the other hand, doesn't actually have this capacity for quick recovery, which people may think is bad, but healthy actually doesn't get ill. So it's not a disadvantage to healthy to not have this capacity for quick recovery. Likewise, when someone exists, it is bad that they suffer, but it's good that they have ways of overcoming that suffering and ways of being able to attain pleasure and comfort and the nice things in life. On the other hand, someone who never existed, whilst they don't have those nice things like the comfort and the pleasure, they never needed that in the first place because they simply don't exist. There is no desire or need for those things to be fulfilled to make it a good thing for them to have it. And so it doesn't seem like it's an advantage to the existent to have these things like, for example, eating cake, having a warm evening by the fire, hanging out with friends and family, and all the other enjoyable or fulfilling things. There is just simply non-existence when it comes to someone who never existed. On the other hand, if someone never existed, then no one was brought into existence to go through the suffering. And so for this reason, it is often said by antinatalists that there's no advantage to coming into existence, but there is a disadvantage, which is the suffering. Number 2 is humans are pretty terrible for the world. Now, this point focuses on the harm that humans do to the environment and the planet, and I tend not to like to talk about those things because I think the environment or the planet just become these amorphous terms which don't really point to anything that I think has ethical significance. I think the thing that we should care about is sentient beings who are impacted by the impact that we have on ecosystems, for example, weather systems, and the planet in general. And it is true that when it comes to non-human animals, humans have not treated them in an ethical way, and they haven't taken them into full account in their ethical decision making, to put it lightly. If we just think of a few things that humans do to other animals, they stab, freeze, strangle, bludgeon, burn, scold, drown, torture, and do more to these animals. And this is actually part of the misanthropic case for antinatalism, which I will link in the description, and it was put forward in a chapter written by David Benatar in a larger text, which I will link in the description for anyone who's interested. And finally, number 1 is humans are pretty terrible to each other. So often when people think about their relation to other people, they think about the positive things. But if we look throughout history, humans have done pretty awful things to each other, including multiple holocausts, multiple genocides, torture, rape, discrimination. The list goes on and on and on. If you want to find more detail, again, you can go to the Misanthropic Case for Antinatalism, which I've linked in the description, by David Benatar, and you can find more there. So that was the list of 10 reasons that antinatalists think you shouldn't have been born. Let me know if you think anything was missed off the list. Let me know if you think there was anything else to add in the commentary on the list that I missed out, and I will see you in the next one.